Now this is going to be a little strange, this video, because we're discussing a class which was very much designed by the World War II generation in the context of the Vietnam War and the Cold War. I'm talking about the Nimitz Class. They started their design process in the 1960s, and their first one was laid down in 1968. 23 years after World War II. So, yeah, the generation officers in charge of that program had mostly begun their careers in World War II. And whilst the Nimitz is expected to be replaced by the John F. Kennedy, the new Gerald R. Ford class vessel coming into service, at some point in 2025, 2026, she's already been, well, we consider her 52, nearly 53 years of age, as it's May 1972 that she's launched. She was commissioned in May 1975. She has to get the May next year, and she's 50 years of commissioned service. 50 years of service for the US Navy. Hard service. The Nimitz class are an interesting class to study because they've been in service a long enough time. It is a historical analysis, but honestly, they're still in service, so they're still earning their stripes. They're still proving themselves, and they're still being modernized and upgraded. You know, the most recent incarnation of the class, the most recent member of the class, the George H.W. Bush, is probably at the forefront of the United States Navy's uncrewed aviation vehicle efforts. Pretty much the vast majority of carrier testings, especially all the ones which have had all the publicity about, have been from her. And yet, we're talking about a class which are not the Queen Elizabeths of their generation. They're not the Dreadnought of their generation. They are the Revenge class, the R class of their generation. They are the numbers. They are the volume which shows that you really can't compete, or rather which raises the bar to compete just that bit too high. When they are being designed, the Soviet Union is starting to consider carriers. When they're coming into service, that's starting to think about them. It'll be a long time before they get them, but they're starting to think about them. A long time before they get them. And this was America signifying it ruled the world. I read some very interesting lines somewhere about them being to support other types of carriers. They're not. They're to lead the way. But the thing is, they're to lead the way in a way which is so much more affordable than the Enterprise was. As sexy and wonderful as the USS Enterprise was, the nuclear-powered vessel, as absolutely barnstormingly overpowered as she was, that was not a vessel you could build a class of, even if you were in the United States in that period of the Cold War. Yes, your budget is virtually endless, but believe it or not, even endless has an end. And building a whole class of 11 of those would have found the end of it. Probably about class vessel number 4 of the class. And then the American Navy might have ended up having to actually implement the sea control ship. And that's a whole different discussion, the sea control ship, but let's be honest, that comes from the idea of, can we do these things for cheap? And the case is yes, as long as we want our ships to be single-purpose carriers, them to be doing one job. Maybe 1.5 missions. But definitely not a full spectrum capability. And the trouble is, though, carrier sees carrier. And the US government, the US Senate will just see, well, that's just another class of carrier. But they're a lot cheaper than this class of carrier. So let's build lots of those. They'll save money. And then probably won't build enough of them. That's why you end up with the big carriers being built. because ultimately they are the most efficient when it comes to aviation operations. Because it's once you get above 60 aircraft, before you get to about 100 aircraft, that's where the efficiency lies, of humans, of machines, of being able to organize all the different moving parts to make a carrier so lethal to the enemy, but also so very, very lethal to your own people. It's a very complicated machine of machines. System of systems. It is an absolute ballet show every time they're moving aircraft around in the hangar and the flight deck and making sure it all works and all maintenance is taking place. It is choreography on a stage which has very real life or death consequences if you get it wrong. So yeah, the conception, operation and conclusion of Nimitz Class, but it's not really a conclusion, let's be honest. That's why I sort of changed some of the title, because they're still in service. And because whilst, yes, Nimitz is supposed to go in 2025, 2026, there is the possibility she doesn't. There is the possibility, with the realization of the level of complexity of this world currently, of the fact that there are growing near-peer, if not peer threats, in terms of antagonism, if not maybe actual technological ability, that have to be managed. And the tool with which the US Navy has to manage them is an aircraft carrier. It's the Nimitz Class. They are the backbone of America. They are how they signal interest. We deploy bombers. Well, yeah, that means you have a base setup that has bombers. You deploy a carrier battle group. Hello? The only thing higher than that is, we've deployed an armoured division. Oh, frigate, you're coming for me. A carrier battle group is the single most useful instrument at the Pentagon's disposal when the president asks for, I want to make a diplomatic signal. I want to signal my interest in something. I want to show the world that we are watching, and I'm going to be taking very close attention and very close attendance of what is going on in this area. The trouble is, a carrier battle group in its full strength is rather a large tool. And when your option below that is a destroyer, and very much a destroyer, the world's most famous destroyer class, the Arleigh Burkes, but still a destroyer, and some of the most capable destroyers in the world, but still a destroyer, you have a problem. You have a real problem with signaling. In that the carriers will often be called on for even more than they possibly should be. You see, traditionally, if we look at most navies, when they were the world's maritime policemen, they had the local presence ships, and they had the heavy presence ships, which were regional, and then they called in the battle groups, the battleships, and the higher status units. The LCS doesn't really count as local presence ship. That counts more equivalent to what a 1920s sloop was, or a small other destroyers in those periods. You know, wandering around. Yes, they're a presence, but they are more of a gunboat level presence than a warship level presence in the views of quite a lot of local populace. The destroyers, the Burkes, are trying very hard to fill both levels of cruiser presence for the US Navy, as you had in the 1920s and 30s. And the trouble is, with them filling both roles, that means the carrier battle groups also have to sort of step in when you need something more than that. There is no point of escalation between them. And this causes a problem. This means that you either decide something is worth a carrier presence or it really isn't. And if it isn't, that might be taken as you're actually not that interested, which is a problem for your signaling. But it's also a problem for your carriers, because you might then go, well, hang on, it's not really worth a carrier presence, but if we don't send one, it's going to become a problem real fast. Which means your carrier fleet, your Tenacious Ten of the Nimitz Class, are quickly getting committed everywhere, are quickly being overworked. Even when you do measure their fuel range in years. I do love the amount of people who took the whole idea of the bulbous bow has been fitted to these ships from, I think, the George Washington onwards, because of fuel efficiency. They're nuclear powered and we measure their range in decades. The other consideration is speed. They're openly admitted. Speed and fuel efficiency. And people focus in on the fuel efficiency. Am I the only one who's watching it going, yeah, you've fallen for the trap there? You can argue, yes, it's more efficient. You can get more out of the engines in that you can run them at slightly lower levels and still achieve the same speed. So yes, that's more efficient, but that's more service efficient, service life and engine life efficient than it is fuel efficient. But speed, well, does it get you a higher speed? Oh. And that's useful. That's very useful because, let's be honest, this class, as gorgeous as they are and as wonderful they are still only 10. They're still only 10 vessels. And that means that more often than not, at least 2 of them are in very heavy duty maintenance. They have to be. You are landing and launching aircraft from their flight decks on a regular basis, doing all sorts of efforts on their lifts, i.e. they're taking controlled crashes landing on their aft deck many times a day. This is going to wear down a ship. It's sailing around the world. It's dealing with salt water non-stop. This is just not good and requires you to thoroughly work through the vessel. So usually at least 2 are in long-term maintenance, 2 will be probably in very short-term maintenance, 2 will be working up, and that will leave you a maximum of 4 to cover the whole world with. At best. That's if you haven't had to surge ships at any point, i.e. breaking the maintenance chain and maintenance flow, and so therefore have not developed a maintenance backlog, which might mean even more have to be in various forms of refit and maintenance and working up. And the trouble is, if you depend on them for your presence, if you depend on them for your ability to say, no, don't do that, when the people aren't listening to your other warnings, that means you're going to need them a lot. These have become, more than anything, the symbols of America on the world stage. Not just American power, not just American presence, but America. They are it. They are what both reflects its status as the primus inter pares of the world, the first amongst equals, but also what define its status as that. The fact that the US Navy has 10 such ships in service, which each tote more aircraft than many air forces in the world are able to put together. That's scary. But vessels which have been the backbone of a nation for very nearly 5 decades, well, they've gone through some changes in that time. Their air groups especially have evolved. Their purpose has evolved in some ways. And more importantly, the fleets around them have evolved. Whilst they are still there, the escort numbers certainly aren't. The task groups, which used to be quite so large, contain battleships as part of the escorting forces, no longer remain. And that's again another reason why they are being so heavily used. There just aren't the options in the pared down, slimline fleet of today. I'm not saying the US Navy is small. It's not small. Anyone who tries to tell you it's small is trying to pull your leg, honestly. Or they are seriously misinformed. But it's not got the capability spread it used to have. In fact, there are several pictures which I found during this research and during this discussion and this video, putting this video together, that really do illustrate the way the US Navy has changed over those 50 years. And that's the other thing this could be used to describe. 50 years of change. The Sentinels, the Tenacious 10 Sentinels during the 50 years of change. We'll see. Shameless book plug. Oh, it's almost 17 minutes. So, why do I do a book plug in every single video? Well, I'm a British naval historian, and if you don't know about academic careers, good for you. I love it, but I did go into it with my eyes open. I knew exactly what I was getting myself in for. My elder sister is an academic as well, a civil engineer. A really, really good one. So I had a fair idea what an academic career was going to be like before I even got it. I also had a good look around while I was a PhD student. I knew the odds of getting a tenured post are never high. You can be as good as anything and still not get it. The main ways to get it are keep plugging away for decades after you get your PhD, and to publish your books and make sure hope they sell well. Well, I have never been one to leave things to fate. So as I'm doing these videos, no one else is going to advertise my books for me but me. So I advertise my books. I shamelessly plug my books in every single video, and I like this Destroyer book. This was my first book. It's also been my second. It's also the first one which got to second edition, and I'm hoping it gets to a third edition because I can add some more chapters in. And it's a really cool book. I have got more coming at Christmas, but moving house, being ill, and all sorts of other weird things have delayed all sorts of things, the books for a while. And mainly they've delayed me in putting together the money necessary to buy the pictures for the books. Because it's buying picture rights are the big expensive part of an academic book, of any kind of history book. There are several very nice repositories where they're free, but it's the few pictures you want from, let's say, the Imperial War Museum's collection, etc., which are going to cost you an absolute bomb. They always do. There are discussions going on with that one, and it's still there's been even a legal case not too long ago, and we're waiting to see what the results are going to be and how that's going to peter out. But hopefully I will get at least one book out for Christmas, if not two, if I can manage to sort out the finances after moving house. But currently, the new house, the new office, are kind of draining funds. So it's the gentleman who spent the day on the phone to roofers. They're very nice people. They're always so nice to you while they're telling you how many thousands of pounds they want to charge. But that's life. And thank you to all of you, because your support has made this book sell, has allowed me to be a public-facing naval historian, has allowed me to do all this, and there's going to be a bit of couple of announcements at the end of the video after I've done the topic of the video's questions. So please do stay tuned for that if you're interested in learning some of the stuff I'm doing and what I'm currently fundraising for and what some current plans are with videos. So, the concept of the mission for these ships, this would-be backbone of the US Navy, was unsurprisingly rather broad. Honestly, they were looking at them and they wanted something which was far more survivable than previous carriers. After all, they were involved with a Cold War versus the peer threat that was the Soviet Union. They very clearly understood what the Soviet Union's plan for naval warfare was. It was overwhelming bomber and submarines and everything else it could get its hands on. And honestly, with the intelligence the US were dealing with at the time, they were also realizing pretty heavy missile strikes were coming in. So they wanted a ship that could take a beating and still keep on beating. That's the core part of it. That's seen as some of the design decisions made. They also wanted strategic mobility. This is one of the reasons why you go for nuclear power. It allows you both high speed and allows you to be moved from theatre to theatre. So it gives you strategic mobility. It also gives you tactical mobility to speed, but let's be honest, when you're dealing with a vessel which is roughly 100,000 tons plus, its turning circle is never going to be that small, so calling it tactical manoeuvring is... it's something on a sliding scale. They can manoeuvre quite tactically for something which is that size. Just about. But the thing is, they can go very fast, which helps with air operations, and they can go very fast for a very long amount of time. And as they're originally conceived, there are nuclear-powered escorts, like you see California and South Carolina here. These two California-class nuclear-powered cruisers. And that means that if you want to maneuver a carrier from one theatre to another theatre, and you want her to go as fast as possible, that doesn't matter. She's not going to be doing it unescorted. Nope. You've got two cruisers which can keep up with her the whole way around. Now that is something you need in a peer threat environment. Okay? The moment you start to realize that navies are no longer thinking, especially the US Navy is no longer thinking about dealing with a peer threat, is when they start getting rid of nuclear cruisers. Because that means there is a theoretical scenario where their carrier is going to be unescorted. Now, you can say, well, her air group will protect her, you know. The helicopters and the things operating from her, the strike aircraft, the aircraft, they can all keep her safe. And they can. They can. But there is a reason why we operate on a layered air defense model for our fleet operations. Because that is the security blanket. That is the safety net. That is the... oh, if the outer layer, for some reason, you manage to get past that, don't worry, there's another layer. And then there's another layer, and 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 there's another layer. And you've got to get through a whole lot of layers before you get to the prize. This is a decent game of pass the parcel. It is not something crappy which only has one layer of wrapping paper. That is just giving a present. That is not a game of pass the parcel. Not saying childhood trauma coming out here at all. The whole point is you have the layers, and the layers are provided by these vessels. You don't need all your escorts to be nuclear powered, because let's be honest, the scenario is when you are going to have to move a carrier from one theatre, let's say the Pacific, to the Atlantic at maximum speed as quickly as possible, are going to be rare. The trouble is, when they happen, you're going to need them to jolly well happen right then. But again, the scenarios where they are likely to happen are mostly when you're dealing with peer threats, and peer threats who are multi-ocean. See the point here? If you have a multi-ocean peer or near-peer threat, that is when you need to do that maneuvering. The moment you no longer are facing that level of threat, it's expensive. But that's part of their original concept of operations. That's why you have 10 of these ships. They're going to be the backbone of the fleet. You're going to be able to rapidly move them around to reinforce your fleet, so suddenly you have the carriers where you need them when you need them. You need to do a major operation, you can do it. You need to do another major operation on the other side of the world, don't worry. Once this operation is done, the time spent maneuvering between these forces is going to be as quick as we can possibly make it. Quick enough that the enemy probably isn't going to be prepared for it, because they're probably not going to think we can adjust that quickly. But thanks to replenishment at sea and the speed of these ships, we can do that. Now then you have to think about their sortie generation, because that's coming in the Vietnam War. That's also World War II, but that sortie generation is coming in. It has come from World War II with the big strike capability, but also the sortie generation in terms of the island campaign, supporting the Marines, and now with Vietnam. The concept of being able to keep a constant operation, a constant flow of aircraft. The whole of the flight deck, the design is around making flight operations as flexible as possible. You want to arrange for a large alpha strike? You can do that. You've got a deck space. You want to keep a constant flow of aircraft in the air, carrying out strike missions, air defense, all these operations, you can do it. And guess what? You've got the air group size that you can do that. You've got a flexibility of air group that you can do that. But to do that, you're going to need a lot of stores. You're going to need a lot of fuel. And that's another reason where nuclear power comes in very quickly, very useful very quickly, because it means all the space you usually use to store ship fuel, you can use for storing aviation fuel and munitions. Which does cause some interesting things, because some people then go, well, actually they're also higher risk because more of their hull is used for storing aviation fuel and ammunition for their aircraft than on previous designs. And you go, well, of course it is. It's nuclear powered. What else would you use that space for? Because let's be honest, the length of the flight deck and length of the ship is to an extent defined by the space you want for the flight deck. You've got engines, but nuclear reactors, etc., and these things are very efficient space-wise in terms of the size of hull you're dealing with for its power density. And what you're really talking about is your flight deck space. And to have the flight deck big enough for what you want to do with it, that's going to require a big ship. And if you want to have all those aircraft aboard, they're going to require a lot of crew to support them. Not just the air crew, not just the fitters and maintainers and people who are supporting the aircraft, but all the people who support them. From the command staff and team of the admiral and all those people serving intelligence roles and information acquisition roles and radar roles and all the specialists. But then all the people supporting them, the people providing the food, the people providing the plumbing, the people providing the ship. It's going to be intensive, especially on the US Navy's crewing model. Which basically requires people to be watching everything all the time. Because that's the way they work. That's you could say a damage control model which they adopted during World War II and served them very well during World War II, and when they started to forget it, they had major problems and they brought it back and they have stuck to it ever since, because they know it works. So you can understand that. That is a legacy of trauma. Both the initial trauma in World War II, but also subsequent trauma when they started to look at doing something else. Legacies of trauma in navies are hard to forget. So you could say the concept of their mission is they're the quarterback of the US Navy's fleets. They are going to be going everywhere and directing their forces and being the core part of their forces. They're going to be where they need to be, when they need to be, with all they need to be there with. That's the Nimitz Class. But there is a problem. there is a small problem in that 2009 is not just when this picture is taken of George Washington, it's also when George H.W. Bush, the last member of this class, is commissioned. So let's think about that. From the first vessel being laid down in June 1968 to the last vessel being commissioned in January 2009, we are talking 40 and a half years. 40.5 years. We're talking a long time, or 40 years, 6 months to put it the more normal way, but I wanted to put it slightly oddly so you'd think about it. It's an old lecturer's trick. For over 40 years have passed between the first vessel being laid down and the last one commissioning. So for some reason, I can't think why, the mission and the reality of the mission changes and starts to affect the design as it's coming through. There's also the fact that when people start to go, well, you know, the Gerald R. Ford class are coming in, so they're the new backbone of the US Navy. No, there's still currently 10 of these vessels, Nimitz Class, in service, and the last one was only commissioned in 2009. If it serves like Nimitz, it could be here till 2059. Think about that. No, think about it properly. It's 2024. I am 37 years old. By the time the George H.W. Bush is up for its retirement, I should be 72, if all has gone to plan. I could still be making YouTube videos, or 3D hologram lectures. Who knows what I'll be doing by that point. But this is the scale we're talking about. This class was in service before I was alive, and they'll be in service till I'm in my 70s and very close to drawing pension officially in the UK. And there is certainly good chance that the B-52 could still be in service by that point, let's be honest. I'm really not sure it'll ever get retired. And B, there is a chance that, especially with all the stuff that George H.W. Bush has been doing, but also the ships from George Washington onwards have been doing and have been involved in terms of their design growth, they could be in service till 2068. They could be in. You could have had Nimitz class vessels in. Well, they could be in service till 2075, in which case they could complete a century of commissioned service with the U.S. Navy. That's quite possible. It's going to depend on what happens, what threats arise, and how fast the construction goes of the Fords, I guess. Or what comes after the Fords, who knows with the current debate. But the point is, the reality of the mission has always been just as important as the concept of the mission to what has driven their capabilities, what has driven their change, what has driven their shape. And one of the things you start to realise about the reality of the mission is that they start off with the ideas of Vietnam and the Cold War and World War II. And they're all mixing together these lessons and ideas to generate this ship. But as time goes on, the world keeps changing. But the utility of the carriers don't. Because the point about a carrier, as you can see with this wonderful picture of George Washington's hangar, is they are big open spaces you can change around. You want to configure it for humanitarian relief? Don't worry, go ahead, you can do that. You want to configure it for counterterrorism? It's got an air group, it can do that. You want to configure it for peer-on-peer conflict? It can do that. You want to configure it for maritime search or search and rescue at sea? It can do that. You want to configure it that air group any way you want? You can do that. You can use that space. And that makes them both incredibly valuable but also incredibly in demand. And it's one of the reasons why the reality of the mission evolves far more broadly than it was originally conceived. The reality of the mission is they have to take on more and more duties, especially diplomatic duties. As said, those have expanded both up and down. What used to be a multi-carrier force can now deployed to signal the level of interest can now rest on a single carrier because that's all available. What used to be a nuclear-powered cruiser turning up to go, "Excuse me? Yeah, we're a high-status unit. We're here to signal our very severe interest, and by the way, the next thing above me, you really don't want to come in, because it'll come in and it'll be ready to start taking names. So why don't we go back to a peaceful time?" Well, you know what? They have to do that as well. Everything has to be a carrier, and it has to adjust its posture, its operations to reflect that. Which is what makes them quite so in demand, and I know I keep saying that, but it's true. The flexibility, the different roles are what are making them be in demand. And that demand has had to be reflected in the design and how the vessels have evolved. How flexible the spaces have had to become aboard the ship. Not just the hangar deck, but the command spaces, the conference spaces, some of the hotel spaces, i.e. the accommodations and food preparation areas, have had to become incredibly flexible and adjustable to deal with the changes in the mission and the evolution of the mission. This has been reflected in their refueling upgrades, when they're taken out for their nuclear refueling, the 20-year mark. Takes roughly 3 to 4 years. Well, those are a long period out of service, out of operations, where you can do a lot of work on a ship. You can really go to town reconfiguring it. Because you've got it out there anyway. You're having to gouge great big holes in the hull anyway to refuel the reactors. It's an every 20-year process, but when they need to do it, they need to do it. Now, of course, to keep this flexibility, there have been adaptations over time. There have been changes and evolutions, especially in electronic warfare and their computers and the systems they use to run their systems. There's also been changes in terms of sort of metals and other, how do I put this, materials used in their construction. But broadly speaking, the vitals have stayed remarkably similar over such a long period. It truly has, and yeah, there is. I'm just going to apologise now if at any point the lighting appears weird. The ring light I have keeps flickering. I think I'm going to have to replace it. It's an LED ring light, and it started flickering, and it sometimes goes weird colours, and then I go weird colours, so I do apologise. But, life happens, and frankly, an order of priorities at the moment, that is below a calyx in terms of procurement. So, let's consider the stats of this class. And the big one, the one that makes them quite so interesting and worth 1 million tons in the US Navy's tonnage alone. The fact they are 100 to 104,000 long tons, or 101 to 106,000 tons. Now think about that. The US Navy has over 1 million tons of aircraft carrier in service. 1 million tons. This is one of the reasons why someone tells you that, the US Navy is small compared to other powers. Just remember that. The US Navy has more tonnage of aircraft carriers in service than some navies have tonnage entirely. Cumulatively. They have more. Now, and I'm not talking carriers, I'm talking everything is less than a million tons. Length, 1,092 foot, or 332.8 meters overall. The waterline length is 1,040 feet, and I'm going to say this. I have recorded this section a lot of times, and I keep using the word support a lot, because that is the big thing about this hull design. It is designed to support the strength deck, which is of course the flight deck. It's designed to make sure it's as supported as possible, so the landings and the takeoffs and the repeated operations are going to have the minimal possible wear and tear damage cumulatively. Individual events are still going to happen, which are going to cause damage, but the cumulative effect of all the operations is going to be minimized. Now, you do this by making sure it's as supported as possible. This is by spreading the load, and you can best spread the load when you have a larger base to spread it over, which is why the difference in length between the waterline and the overall being quite so similar is really helpful. Now, what is interesting, though, is that the overall beam is 76.8 meters, or 252 feet, and the waterline is 40.8 meters, or 134 feet. Now, that shows you where they don't need to worry so much about the stresses, because they're able to build out quite a long way from the hull, and that's fine. There's going to be load coming down there, but that load is mostly of the predictable constant type or slowly coming on type. It's not going to be something which is suddenly going to go wham into you and wham or boom off you. That is lengthwise. Hence the length is so much more condensed, realistically. Now, draft, and these are official figures, and again, I am using the Wikipedia rule. Technically, I'm using a book, but that's still covered in the Wikipedia rule. The rule is, if it's been published on Wikipedia, it's the figures on Wikipedia, no one is going to get annoyed with me and say I have been spreading protected information or secret information if it's on there. So, I don't care, because this website is YouTube, not War Thunder. I don't care, and I don't want to hear, oh no, we can pass through shallower depths than that, or oh no, we're deeper than that. I don't care for any of the stats coming up. I'm stating this with the draft, but I don't care as we go on. We are going to go with the official, publicly declared figures for these things, because then it's going to get no one in trouble, me saying them on here. And no, I do not think I am a superstar YouTuber with millions of subscribers, and therefore I'm going to be picked up on news and all that stuff. I don't think that, but I operate on the policy of it's best to always make sure I'm not getting any of my friends or people I've taught into trouble just by talking about stuff which I happen to know. Because the odds are the person governments would focus on, or the people that governments would focus on, would not be the people who told me it. Because the vast majority of my information on these things comes from my dad's pals. I'm going to say that now. They're mostly retired or dead. There are a fair number actually still working. Surprising enough. 70-year-old naval architects are still in great demand. It's one of those careers where if you're good at it, you can still be working on it well into your years when you should be retired. Your golden years, no, there's another generation of ships I want to design. Anyway, so 2 Westinghouse A4W nuclear reactors. Pretty good design. The A4W is a pretty mature design as well. Now, you should realize the designation A stands for Aircraft Carrier Platform, hence A. 4 stands for 4th Core Generation Design, and of course W is Westinghouse. So they are... A4W is what the reactor is called, and that will tell you everything you need to know about it. That it's an aircraft carrier design, so it's a surface vessel design. And they are different. Nuclear reactors designed for surface vessels are different than the ones designed for submarines. 4 is important because it tells you how experienced they are in designing cores, how experienced they are in designing nuclear reactors. That's their 4th core generation. That matters. That is useful. If you want to be slightly worried, the new Gerald R. Ford class is powered by the A1B reactors. They're carrier reactors. The first generation from the Betshell Corporation, who do have a lot of experience with land-based nuclear power plants in the United States, so they have a lot of experience with that, but just remember that they went with the A1Bs, not going on to the lovely people of Westinghouse and asking for their 5th generation. No, they decided to go to another manufacturer. But the A4Ws have proved very reliable and very capable reactors. Now, they don't necessarily have enough power for the future generation. That was what was felt about them, all the things that they wanted to be powered in the future, but they have proved reliable and useful on this class. And those 2 reactors supply 4 steam turbines, which drive 4 shafts for 260,000 shaft horsepower. 260,000 shaft horsepower. That is a lot of horses. That is a lot of power. And please note, the official speed given is 30 plus knots. And their official range is 20 to 25 years. That's their official range. Within that time, they can go around the Earth's surface as many times as they like without stopping. They just keep going. As long as you can keep them supplied with food and crew, they can keep going. Total complement is 5,000 to 5,200. That's usually a ship's company of roughly 3,500 and an air wing of roughly 2,500. And yes, there are variations on that, but that's roughly what you're dealing with. In some nations, that would be called a brigade. But let's be honest, they're deploying a lot more combat power than a brigade would. This is why it's kind of interesting when you get battle groups being formed up and people start sort of equating what should the rank of the senior officer be in charge of this and this formation. When you've got an aircraft carrier, you've got destroyers, you've got maybe a nuclear attack submarine, you've got supply ships. You're talking about firepower equivalents to divisions or more in terms of army usual firepower for army formations. This is not something you want to entrust to inexperienced personnel. And that's sometimes one of the reasons, one of the drivers of this, the rank involved. It's literally, we want someone who's been in service for this long and has impressed us enough. Because at each level, the number of people getting through to that level get fewer and fewer and fewer. And you can view it as sometimes the people promoted are necessarily promoted for the wrong reasons. Sometimes they're the right reasons. Sometimes they're Admiral Beatty, who is very good political admiral, very bad actually admiral in command when you actually look at what he does. But we'll leave that to one side. It's always a safe one to bring up Beatty as the argument, because no one tends to argue about that one. There are a few others who are more subjective, and that would derail the comments below. But that's being saved for the year of leadership, which is next year. This was the year of the aircraft carrier. Sensors and processing systems. Well, there's a lot of them, but you soon notice there is a common theme going on. If you've seen my recent video on the Kiev and Invincible classes, you'll notice the Kiev class was a mixture of radars, both cruiser warship radars and aviation radars. The Nimitz class are rather easy. They're all about the aircraft. They're all about the air operation. Yes, they've got some weapons radars for their operations of the defensive weapons, but mostly, the vast majority, they are about supporting their air group, getting the most out of their air group. It's the same when we look at the electronic warfare and decoys. These are about supporting themselves to be better able to aid their air group and operate in the scenarios. A lot of the defensive depth is down to those escorts, and again, that reminds us of this picture. This was an idea. These were ships, the original concept, the original form of which were developed in a time when there were always going to be escorts with them. There was no scenario where there wouldn't be an escort with them. Usually a pair of them. And if you know anything about the California class, which I did a little video of about in the Year of the Cruiser on this channel, you'll know they were very capable, very highly armed, highly skilled, and well armed, well-rounded warships. So they were exactly the pair. If you're going to be left with only two, you're left with those two. Good luck anyone trying to get through them. But still, that doesn't make this necessarily bad. It just means the reality is these days that maybe their strategic mobility, the limits of their strategic mobility, are the Arleigh Burke class. That can provide them with that protection, and they have to be with them. They have to stick with them. They can't exceed them. They can't leave them behind. Armament. 2 to 3 Mark 29 guided missile launching systems fitted with either 8 RIM 162 enhanced Sea Sparrow missiles or RIM 7 Sea Sparrow missiles. They're slowly being upgraded. I think most of the Sea Sparrows are gone, but I'm not 100% sure, so I left it as both. 3 to 4 Phalanx close-in weapon systems with their 20mm cannons. And 2 Mark 49 guided missile launching systems loaded with either 21 loaded with 21 of the rolling airframe missiles each. And some Mark 38 25mm machine gun systems as well. Because, you know, it's always good to have some extra DACA. Some of the vessels have 2.5 inches of Kevlar over vital spaces, and that is the official listing of that, and that is all I will go into on the armour. Aircraft carried between 85 and 90 fixed-wing and helicopter aircraft. It's a good mix. It's a well-balanced vessel. It is designed to be the aviation hub, the aviation core of an expeditionary fleet, of a presence fleet, of a global fleet, of a fleet that could find itself tasked with any mission anywhere in the world and be expected to do it. But that means they are the aviation core, which means really to evaluate them we have to look at more than just their design and vitals on paper, and we also have to get to their air group. But their design is interesting. The layout of the design, it's more than just the vitals. It's more than just a list of details about them. It's how they've been shaped, how they've been formed. But I'm going to be honest before I get into this too much. I cannot remember where this particular image, cutaway image, comes from. I've had it stored on my computer for so long in files labelled Nimitz Research that are Nimitz Research from back at the beginning of my PhD. So I have no idea, and I haven't done a reverse Google image search, because every time I do I get a whole load of cuttings which look like it but aren't it. So I haven't bothered to do one again before this. But it's a really good one, so I'm using it, and I hope I'm not offending whoever put it together. I'm just saying it's really, really good, so I love to use it when I'm teaching. And because it really does illustrate the design of the hull, and it really illustrates some of the core components of it so well. It shows you how the lifts have been put around and have been worked out with the idea of the aircraft operations in mind. You have the port and starboard lifts aft that can allow you to service both the waste catapults but also the aircraft landing and recovering them into the hangar. You have the forward lifts that allow you to load the aircraft onto the forward catapults. This is to maximize your ability to operate aircraft, to keep simultaneous flows going over the angled flight deck, because this is a full angled flight deck. the more you look at it, the more you realise this is a vessel which has been entirely designed around the needs of aircraft rather than the needs of people. Hence, all the crew accommodations are located where they are. But also, it's orientated around the flight deck operations, even over and above its own defence. Again, consider where the weapon systems that are supposed to defend it, as its last layer of defence before things actually hit it, are located and how they are positioned. Operating aircraft is the key function. And this image really does illustrate that well. But as said, I'm not sure where it comes from, so let's skip on to, well, the first part of their lives, really. Coming into service 1975, they immediately become part of the global conflict management regime they have going on in the Cold War. One of the really interesting things about the Cold War is because of its bipolar nature, the world actually becomes more peaceful in a way. And this gives us a really weird view of international relations when we look back through the prism since World War II. Because the Cold War meant that everyone viewed the thing as even the smallest conflict could, unless it was carefully managed, lead to a nuclear exchange which would end the world between the major powers and the major alliances. So you didn't want it. So those alliance structures spend a lot of time, a lot of effort, trying to make sure all their members didn't act out of concert. Now, of course, there are always still problems and niggles and issues when one side tried to flip another side to when one side tried to flip a nation to its side, etc., and both sides were guilty of that one. But by and large, carriers were a major part of this conflict management, especially for NATO and the Western Alliance and America. And that's what the carriers came into. By the time they came into service, Vietnam was no more. It wasn't part of the operating equation anymore. But what was becoming part of the operation was the Middle East. And the first really major operation for Nimitz was Operation Eagle Claw in 1980, which is when she deployed to the Indian Ocean to support American actions to try and recover hostages from the US Embassy in Tehran. And Nimitz is relieved on a post by Eisenhower, Dwight D. Eisenhower, the second of the class. And pretty much they are constantly relieving each other at this point. But at this point, there's only two by 1980 in service. It's only Nimitz and Dwight D. Eisenhower. Or just the Eisenhower sometimes. Now, what they're mostly doing in this period are things like freedom of the seas, freedom of navigation, patrols, all sorts of things to show that America and the world can go there. And it's actually during a freedom of navigation exercise with the Forrestal, one of their predecessors, the first generation of supercarriers, in August 1981, that two of Nimitz's F-14 Tomcats take part in the shooting down of a Libyan aircraft, which is basically the Gulf of Sidra incident, which again shows the problems in conflict management, in that it's high risk, high stakes, big problems if things go wrong, if something's mismanaged, if something's not put together properly. But this is also the period when they carry their most diverse air groups, where they carry the broadest range of aircraft. They will have all sorts of capabilities on them, which actually means that in many ways it's during the end of the Cold War that their strike range is at its peak in terms of its value peak. Now, there are reasons for this. The end of the Cold War is a period of growing armament, growing strength, but also raising the cost of conflict and raising the cost of peace in many ways by one side versus the other. The example again goes back to the R-class battleships of prior to World War One, of the Anglo-German naval race. The British basically won the naval race with the Queen Elizabeth class, the predecessors. And they did that by raising the cost of a battleship to such an extent that it was going to mean that for the Kaiserkompanie, the German Navy, as German Navy was called at the time, to actually contend with the British, they were going to have to get more money. And to do that, they were going to have to get into a political battle with the army for funding, which they were going to lose. That's something the Royal Navy always knew. But delivering the coup de grace on this was the fact that the Royal Navy asked for 6 battleships in the following year. That were going to be that would eventually be the R class. The Treasury wanted 4, and in a stunning moment of political agreement, due to massive national campaign, they ended up settling on 8. Because what they did was they agreed, we'll give you 4, but we'll also say if you need them, you can get 4 more if the Germans lay down a ship. The Germans still managed to lay down a ship. Dang, the Treasury ends up having to pay for 8. And it was the 8R class which really do stick the knife in many ways on the Anglo-German naval race on the Germans, because when you look at it, the British are building, theoretically, 14 of these 15-inch gun battleships. Now, I know I have my own theory about HMS Agincourt, and I'm going to leave that to one out of this, out of this on this at this time. But the British are basically building these 14 15-inch gun-armed battleships, and the Germans haven't got any in service at that point. And by the time the war ends, they will have 2 units pretty much in service with 15-inch guns, and the British have 5 Queen Elizabeths, 5 Revenge class battleships, and 2 Renown class battle cruisers, which are basically the Revenges adapted. The point is, that's the British basically showing, yeah, once we get into high gear, look what we can kick through. And it's the same in this time with the Nimitz class. The Americans are kicking into high gear. Yes, they've got all these other designs. They've got the Kennedy class. They've got the Forestals. They've got all these wonderful carriers in service. But no, they have raised the bar again. They've taken the idea from the Enterprise and they've turned it into the volume, the mass, to give them the full strategic capability. And they utilize this. They utilize this to make the Soviets really worry about their bastions, their bastion defense, the core component of their security. And you can argue the reason the Soviets actually get into the carrier game themselves, the Kievs and then the Tbilisi, which come of course the Kuznetsovs, and later designs, is because of the Nimitz and the coming force. And what they demonstrate in the exercises and in the operations and cooperations in this period, in the late 1970s and 1980s. Because that is a problem. And they demonstrate it, as said, while having the strongest air group they probably ever have. And this is a good example of it from 1994, but it's not quite the air group they used to have, but it's a good one. Now, why do I not say the most powerful they ever were? Well, it's well known that I have a particular love for the Vigilante, which was a couple of generations ago by this timeline in air group role, and its reconnaissance capability. And it hasn't really been replicated since. So, I'm sorry. I have my favourites when it comes to carrier group forms, but who can really argue against an air group which includes F-14D Tomcats as their air defence in the early 1990s? That's a good force. That is a very strong, very capable air defence force. It has F-18s, Cs. Pretty good all-rounder. A good all-rounder. They were This is one of the reasons why they end up being selected to be basically the sole aircraft going forward. There will be one. We've gone for the aircraft which is 70%, 80% in pretty much all the roles. Apart from one role, we'll leave that. We'll discuss that in a second. You've got the Lockheed S-3B Viking from the Anti-Submarine Squadron. You can see it sitting in the middle of the formation. It's the one literally in the middle. And that's a really cool aircraft and a really cool capability, which has been lost. Two reasons. One, helicopters got better, but also, again, this is one of the things that happens when you lose your peer threat, or rather your near peer threat. You start to think, well, you know, what ranges am I going to be engaging a submarine at? At what point am I going to be dealing with a mass submarine attack? And you've got rid of one of the layers of the anti-submarine warfare defense, because you used to have the P-3 Orions doing the sort of large area patrol of the oceans, along with Certas and various hydrophones of the various, you know, oceanic lines, like the GIUK GATS or SOSUS. And then you had Vikings wandering around. And no, let's be honest, magnetic anomaly detection units are not the world's best wide area scanner for submarine presence. But they are a capability, and they are something which means submarines have to be careful. Because if you get sloppy or you make a little bit of a mistake, you will get detected. Add in the ability to drop sonobuoys and other things, and of course torpedoes, and suddenly you have a problem, because if they get even the slightest twitch, well, they'll drop some sonobuoys in, and then that might well hear you. And then there's a torpedo coming after, and suddenly that adds a layer of, okay, now we have to be careful in this range, because in this range of a carrier or a carrier battle group, we could be dealing with Vikings. And then when we get closer, there's going to be helicopters. And the thing is, what's more important is the information goes back to the carrier, and an anomaly might be noted. Okay, we didn't see anything much on this, but oh, then there's another anomaly spotted later on, which seems to sort of be forming a track of anomalies, and that's when where the Viking really comes in handy. It's about building up your information picture. You've also got the Grumman EA6B Prowler, and you can tell that one because that's the one with the sort of goldish looking cockpit window to help it with its electronic warfare role. That's sitting aft. And then we have a Grumman E2C Hawkeye at the front, and an A6E Intruder, long-range strike aircraft. Basically a flying bomb truck as well rounds out the group. So you have electronic warfare aircraft, you have a bomb truck, you have an heavy air defense specialist, you have all-rounders, you have anti-submarine warfare, and you have airborne early warning and command and control. That's a good mix. That is a really good mix. Now, it doesn't have the helicopters up there, but I suppose they just weren't fitting into the formation that day. But these days, if you were just going to put the aircraft up alongside each other, the different types, for those roles, you'd have a Hawkeye, and you may have two different types of F-18 Super Hornet. The F-35 is starting to come in, but not yet near in enough numbers. There is nowhere near enough of the uncrewed aircraft coming in. What's called the Boeing MQ-25 Stingray. I always want to say Northrop Grumman X-47B, but we'll leave that to one side. If you want more of a discussion of the drones, I have done a drone carrier, future of drones in warfare, in naval aviation not that long ago, so that literally has gone up a couple days before this video goes out, so you should find it on the channel. And that was a discussion of, well, how the US Navy and how other navies are implementing drones into naval aviation. The point is, the air group has thinned out a lot. As the roles of the carrier have diversified even more, and as they've had to take on more as the fleet has pared down, the air group has also been pared down. The air group has also been shrunken down. Pretty much the F-18, the Super Hornet variant, but the F-18, the Hawkeye, because the F-18 couldn't do the Hawkeye role, no matter how many times people tried to do designs of, can we fit this giant radome on top of this airframe? No, you can't. You can't. There's still the Greyhound around, which is the carry-on-board delivery aircraft, but let's be honest, that's not going to be around forever as well. That's also supposed to be replaced with the Osprey. The VF-22 Osprey. Although the US Navy seems to be dragging its feet about that massively. And you can understand in a way, because honestly, they've got a very good COD aircraft, and as long as the airframes are still working, save the money, spend it on other things, spread out the time of delivery. Maybe something better than the Osprey will come available. There's got to be something better than the Osprey out there. Because whilst the Osprey is a very interesting aircraft, it's also a first practical generation of its type aircraft, and the first generation are always full of problems. Look at the first generation of jets, the first generation of high-performance piston-powered aircraft, etc. And look at some of the events that they get involved in. First generation of practical helicopters. People are often jumping on the Osprey is bad bandwagon, but actually the answer is the Osprey is the first generation. And honestly, the real problem is that we haven't moved beyond the first generation quickly enough. Because we haven't. But it's a nice mix of an air group back in 1994. 30 years later, it's a much more pared down air group. Funny to think they've been in service for roughly 20 years by this point. 20 years. Carl Vinson, not that long. After all, she was the third in the service? Named for a congressman congressman from Georgia, who was very, very pro-US naval spending. Tillman never got his battleship, but Vinson got a carrier. Look, before anyone starts critiquing that sort of naming, it's perfectly sensible. If that's who gets you the funding to have the ships, then you reward them. It's kind of like in Britain. Why do we name so many of our ships after our cities and towns? Because that if you name a city or ship after a city or town which has several key constituencies, especially swing constituencies in it, it makes it less likely for political parties, aka governments, to cancel them. It's the same with rewarding politicians for funding key programs. Put their name on something. We usually use libraries, but why not an aircraft carrier? Or a destroyer or something. Anything. If it keeps them interested. What I would also say is the demonstration of this air group also shows the potential what an air group can become again. One of the things that's been driving a lot of cost with development of aircraft recently, I think, is the insistence on one airframe to do all the jobs. And yes, there is some advantages to this, in that you can make that airframe as great as it possibly can be, and you can buy it in numbers which are going to justify the investment that's needed to make it all that it can be. But you have an actual look at that group. No one was sitting down looking at the prowlers and the intruders and going, you know, they're not really worthwhile because they can't really do the air defense mission of the fleet. Now, electronic warfare and attack, that's all they pretty much do. You had it carried enough aircraft, they did the job. Yes, let's say you are carrying a full load of 40 to 60 F-18s. Yes, that does mean you can generate more for your air defense patrol if you want, but if you're using all those aircraft for air defense, why is there only one carrier in there? Because if you need that lot for air defense alone, you should really have multiple carriers on that job, because that's a high-risk, high-stakes job. If you're looking at, say, if you're turning around going, we've got a carrier in, but all it's going to be able to do is do air defense at a task group because it's so high risk. The question is, why are you sending in one battle group and why only one carrier? Not, oh, that's great that we have the capability of all the aircraft to do that job. You're sending in a multi-billion-dollar carrier with billions of dollars of equipment aboard and trained personnel in value, all of it cumulatively probably not far off 100 billion in terms of value to its government, to the government, and you're telling me you're happy that all the aircraft are having to be used for air defense because that's the kind of threat environment it's going into, and you're sending in one carrier and one task group? But also, the scenario here was these aircraft, especially the intruders and the prowlers, had such a long range. They had such a scope for ranged attacks that they gave the carrier a really scary ability. Because with the weapons they could carry, which also had range themselves, they could strike from thousands of miles away. Happily. Easily. That's what they were designed to do. That meant that you could be fighting a battle, you could have a carrier causing you trouble, and it's not a couple hundred miles away. It could be sitting 500, 600, 700 miles away happily, and that's a whole lot of ocean to try and patrol. A whole lot of ocean to try and figure out where they are. Add in 90% of the world's population lives within 200 miles of the coast, and suddenly, if you're able to pop 700 miles out at sea and strike at roughly 1,000 miles away, you've got a lot of capability. But again, that's something you have when you're recognizing a peer threat. And I think this is the trouble we've had for the Nimitz class in the middle of their lives, that the war of choice doctrine really did start to take over after the Cold War ended. You see, because when the Cold War ended, the US, backed by its carrier arm, its stealth bombers, its huge advanced armed forces, millions of personnel, and massive, burgeoning, growing economy still, were pretty much so far beyond everyone that no one would willingly choose to fight a war against them. And when you have such overwhelming power, you can become prey to overwhelming hubris. And the hubris was the wars of choice doctrine. That wars in future would only ever be fought when the major powers chose to fight them. Otherwise, no one would fight a war. No one would dare attack their oil tankers. No one would dare start attacking their cargo ships. No one would be firing missiles at their merchant ships going through one of the world's great international maritime choke points. No one would do those sorts of things. No one would invade a nation which they've all put their arms around and collectively gone, we've embraced this nation and their growing democracy. No one would dare do anything like that in the 1990s. That was the idea, early, the sort of whole period of the 1990s, because we are so powerful. We're so much more powerful than everyone else. Read for that, we are so much better than everyone else. That was the ego talking. We'd won the Cold War. We were the true power. We could choose. We were so powerful we could choose our own destiny. No one could take it from us. No other actor on the stage was able to direct their fate. Only we were the actor-directors. Only we were the producers of this global theatre. Yeah, that hubris didn't last long. It shouldn't have lasted really past the first Gulf War, but sadly enough we won that rather quickly. Good from the point of view of the civilians involved and the countries which are occupied, bad from the point of view of our egos and the political the egos of the civilian leaderships, because they suddenly got a taste of this is what wars are going to be like. You don't have things like Yugoslavia, you have, Yugoslavia, Balkans, depending on what you want to call it. You have all the other operations which go on in the 1990s, and the ongoing theme is one of, we have come with our power. You do not want to fight us. We overwhelm you. But also, as you watch it go on, you can see there's a growing problems in that doctrine. Quite a few thinking personnel, quite a few informed commentators, were never comfortable with that idea, with that concept. In my own case, speaking as someone who was a teenager in many of those years, I really wasn't comfortable with it. I really didn't think it was a good idea. 1990s, I was growing up in, I was watching it and thinking about it and listening to the people of my family who are involved in all these things and thinking, but it doesn't matter that Terry at school is bigger than all of us and has had a real massive growth spurt. We all still like to tag him in it, because he has to be careful running around after us, because if he plays too rough, the teachers think he's bullying us. So that was my first time thinking about something which would later, in my mind, correlate with public opinion. The fact you can be restrained by your own public from using the full freedom of capabilities at your disposal because you look mean. Which is a problem. Because playing fair in war is a good way to get yourself killed. War is not about playing fair. Professional warfare is not about in any way or shape or form playing fair. It's about winning. Winning is fair. Do you know why it's fair? Because if you win, the one person who wins quickest, usually, hopefully they've done it right, suffers the fewest casualties. And is best able to keep their people alive, and so keep their own country safe. And that's the purpose of armed forces. Countries might use them for other things, but ultimately their purpose is keeping their country safe. Ultimately. Now, the carriers were a core part of all this, but again, you have another problem coming about. Because if you consider the 1990s, when you have 4 carriers turn up for Battle Force Zulu in the Gulf War, those are primed and ready ships. Ships which are at the apogee of carrier warfare. You have Midway, arguably the relic from World War II by this point, but she's still viable, capable, and she's running it. You have Roosevelt. Theodore Roosevelt. CVN 71. The fourth of the Nimitz class. The fourth of the Nimitz class. And then you have Ranger and America. Two more of the in-between vessels. The vessels between the Midways, the Forrestal's, and the Nimitz class. One nuclear-powered carrier, four three conventional powered carriers, and all of them operating together to decimate the forces they are sent to attack. They are a mobile capability which you cannot track. You cannot find these bases using Google Maps. You cannot find these bases using a guy on a motorbike, which is what they usually seem to send. You can only find these bases if you have the ability to surveil the maritime sphere very well. And you have to remember that if you're using satellites and those things to track carriers, those satellites are being tracked. And they might find themselves blinded. They might find themselves knocked out of orbit. They might find themselves reporting the wrong information because every time they go anywhere near the carriers, smoke's going off and the carriers are going in a completely different direction than they're actually normally heading. Which throws off all sorts of calculations. Or you might have the US doing one of their plans for the Cold War, which was to use carrier, and they were quite openly discussing this at one point, after the Cold War. It's amazing how much got discussed after the Cold War's over and won, and they no longer had to worry about it because it's never going to happen again. The idea of using one carrier group to maybe distract the satellites by having them focus on it, and to provide cover for another group of carriers which do somewhere else. Because the thing is, you can't afford to ignore a carrier battle group which is coming towards you. You might think they have more carriers available than are coming towards you, but the carrier battle group that's coming towards you, you have to pay attention to, whether you want to or not. But in all these wars of choice, in all this period, no one really fights back. Yes, there are incidents, but those incidents involve escorts. They don't involve the carrier battle groups, they don't involve the carriers. You might want to make a play for them, but actually succeeding and turning desire into actual action is hard enough. Turning action into anything like success, with the sheer volume of firepower a carrier battle group brings to the table in defensive terms, let alone offensive terms, before you even get to the point of trying to get at it, that's not good for you. Because the carrier battle groups at this point, especially in this period, were still operating largely on the concepts from the Cold War. There's a lovely picture of the George Washington sailing around. She's got 3 Ticos, Ticonderoga class cruisers with her, 3 Arleigh Burkes, an Oliver Hazard Perry, and a submarine. And that's what you can see in the that's what you can sort of work out from the notes in the picture. And the supply ships. That's one carrier. These days they usually have about 4 Burkes. There's a slight difference in that group size. As said, it's pared down. It's pared down. And then the War on Terror happens, and you have a whole load of people making a whole load of decisions. One of those is that, well, along with wars of choice, the era of peer competition is over. It's going to be counterinsurgency from here on out. From here on out, no mature nation, no modern nation is going to declare war on another modern nation. Well, to be fair, they don't. They tend to prefer special military operations. But, you know, that's neither here nor there. No one's going to do that. And it's as this goes on that you hear more and more strange discussions around carrier strength going on. And the US Navy is having to sacrifice more and more elsewhere to preserve its carrier strength. In the face of people going, well, is this really sensible? When you're talking about the sheer level of firepower they bring, it is. And utility they bring, it is. It's very difficult to build a new aircraft carrier. It's very difficult. Just look at the time it takes for the Americans to build them. Principally because they've managed to let themselves get talked down to one source of supply. And only producing enough to keep one source of supply open. Not sure how that's happened. The exact story never seems to add up to me, and I'm fairly sure there's a lot more going along behind the scenes that's not written down and not available to be viewed. But the Americans end up with a trickle supply of a lot of supersized carriers and one yard doing all the work. Great for that yard, terrible for the American taxpayer, and terrible for American security. This picture has Ronald Reagan, Kitty Hawk, and Abraham Lincoln on their first cruise on Reagan's first cruise in 2006. It was a good cruise. It was a good cruise. At this point, of course, Lincoln, in the background, is I think she was the fifth of the Nimitz Class into service. And Kitty Hawk, well, she was the last of the the conventionally powered supercarriers to be in service. It's a shame. I don't think any of the supercarriers so far have survived. I don't think even Enterprise, that first nuclear carrier, is going to survive. I think, as I understand it, although this can always be left up to the vagrants of US politics, so you always have to be quite careful before you say things until they actually happen. She's going to be disposed of beginning in 2025, but actually this, interesting enough, could be a problem for actually the service exit of some of the Nimitz class, because it's going to take at least 5 years for Enterprise to be scrapped. That starts in 2025, which means the next slot the facility is probably going to have they can basically dispose of one carrier at a time, is going to be 2030. So, if Nimitz goes out of service when she's supposed to, in 2026, she could be sitting around for 4 years. Now, yes, you have to take her through some deactivation protocols, etc. But honestly, it doesn't take 4 years. And she's a worked up ship. And considering all that's going on in the world. But there again, that's 5,000 extra personnel you need to find, and for those few years, and the budget, and all the other things to operate it. So, it'll be interesting to see what happens come January. Let's put it this way. It'll be interesting to see what happens come January. For those who don't realise, it's an election year for the Americans. If you've managed to be under a complete rock and not noticed it in 2024. Now, The War on Terror did actually bring back the utility of the carriers in some regards to the forefront of people's minds, because they could turn up where you needed and offer the firepower where you needed when you needed without basing rights. So it meant that you didn't have to necessarily ask allies for permission, let alone asking people who weren't allies for permission. It's one of the things when America started to realize at this point that maybe not all their allies were as firm allies as they thought they were, and that there actually could be problems with this. It was quite a scary time in some regards, this period for the Americans, because first of all, in 2001, they are hit. And it's one of those scenarios where they've been thinking it might be an option for years, it might be a potential threat, but they had never thought it would become such a big threat. It would jump from down here as a threat to... And honestly, there are parts of the discussion and parts of the scenario which should probably have been addressed earlier, but they hadn't been because of the realities of the time, because of the assurance of the time. And that's one of the reasons why I think you get quite so many conspiracy theories about the War on Terror in its beginning, because everyone was feeling so confident, so powerful, they can't imagine how they were taken by surprise. Ego and hubris will do that for you a lot of the time. Ego, hubris, combined with a view that, well, defense and security, no one's going to attack us, so why are we spending any money on it? And why are we being serious about it? Will cause you more trouble than anything else. Ultimately, my problem usually with most conspiracy theories, and pretty much all the ones around this period on a strategic level, are why try to ascribe malice and forethought to things which can be far more easily and far more normally explained by hubris, ego, and stupidity. It takes effort for humans to have malice and forethought and planning. It's often their laziness, which means they haven't done the right things to make things work. But the carriers were good. But again, the carrier groups by this point are suffering. They are down to F-18s only. And to be fair, that's fine for this. Again, the F-18 is a more than capable aircraft in air defense role for this period. There is really not much of a threat to it. The number of jokes and memes going around which are basically, this is a US Marine Corps F-18, or this is a US Navy F-18, send them up, I'll wait, to the things of various air control towers going, leave this area or we will send fighters to engage you. It usually split the jumps between North Korea and Iran, but we'll leave that to one side for the memes. And that was quite true. You have possibly some of the best trained pilots, certainly some of the pilots who get the most flying hours in the world, coupled with an aircraft which had has some of the best electronics in its period, and definitely some of the best air-to-air missiles and other systems in its time period, and you have an absolutely lethal aircraft. Is it as lethal as the Super Tomcat would have been? Probably not. But that was a heavy air-to-air fighter, not a all-rounder. The same Tomcat, would it have been necessarily as good or as cheap in terms of flight hours as F-18s to keep up the hours with budgets being cut? Probably not. And that's the reality. As much as I'd love to keep the F-14 around and various other things, the flying hours of the F-18, especially when you're carrying the sheer volume of numbers you were, and you are, at this period, works out a lot cheaper and a lot easier to maintain than the F-14s. And flying hours, i.e. like gunnery drill in the Age of Sail, are critical. The amount of hours your air crews spend in the air, the amount of times your deck crew cycle aircraft to launch and recover and move things around the deck, the amount of times your fitters work on things, all these things add up as experience to improve your personnel and improve your capabilities. So whilst the War on Terror was not necessarily good for peer-on-peer conflict experience, and not necessarily good for how to manage task groups, they try to keep exercises to keep up those skills and to promote people who were able to do it. But it was good from a perspective of flying hours, and from giving your air crews a lot of practice of being in the air. Again, not much dogfighting skills or air-to-air engagement skills, because the organizations they were engaging didn't tend to have aircraft. But you can always exercise against each other, and that is something which NATO, which the Americans and all the other powers involved really do take to heart. The trouble is, though, and this is what started to emerge especially in the 2010s, is that history hasn't ended. Humanity still does what humanity does, and the world is a lot more complicated than we might wish. What do I mean by history hasn't ended? Well, that's the point. When you start to think of the world as no longer having peer-on-peer conflict, when you think we've grown out of it, we haven't. You sort of think like you are now dictating history. History has ended. There's no more lessons to learn because you've risen above it. You're not going to do the same things that used to happen in the past. You've moved beyond it. It's always worrying when people say that, mostly to historians going, that literally the whole purpose of our job, for starters, is to teach you about the past to hope you stop you repeating the same mistakes of the past. But more importantly, it's you do realise that in 1920 they were saying that the war to end all wars had been fought and there'd be no more wars because of the Great War, as they called it at that point. Which is kind of an interesting thing to call it, the First World War, the Great War, but you have to remember it has a slightly different connotation to how we phrase it today. And then you start going through it and go, yeah, this is not good. It's not the first time we've had this kind of conversation. It's not the first time we've had this kind of hubris. But maybe we were lucky. Because they managed to live in that bubble for roughly a decade. And then another decade and a half of a bubble which believed that the future of wars were going to be counterinsurgencies, were not going to be unleashing the full industrialized conflict the nation-state conflict brings about. Because, let's be honest, when nation-states go for it, they really do. But what's really interesting, and I know I know that phrase, but I really do, in this period, is some of the ranges of discussions which go on. There's even at one point the 1,000-ship Navy plan. An homage, of course, to the 600-ship Navy plan, which had been brought up during the Reagan era, as we must expand the US Navy to 600 ships so we can deter conflict with the Soviets. Let's just basically pick a nice figure. And then they go for a 1,000-ship Navy plan. And the idea was that all the Allies would be incorporated in it. Now this leaves out a small problem. Not all the Allies produce vessels to the same standard as the US Navy. Even the Allies who do tend to have things they want to do with the ships themselves, not necessarily conform to the US Navy's great plan of where they want ships to be when they want ships to be. They have their own national interests and issues they have to deal with. And yes, most of the time they might converge with the American national interests, which is great when they do. But some of the time they won't. And some of the time they'll have domestic political issues which will take priority, or their own international political issues which will take priority over what the American Navy would like them to do. And so very quickly your 1,000-ship navy doesn't exist. There are a few small shining examples of where it actually has to an extent worked. One of them is the Royal Navy. The Queen Elizabeth class carriers. They've proved to be pretty darn useful because they carry F-35Bs, which are a fairly useful stealth aircraft, let's be honest. And they are big enough and have enough presence, especially when wrapped in a Royal Navy plus Allied task group, which often enjoys the presence of at least an Arleigh Burke class destroyer from the American Navy as well, giving them 3 destroyers as escorts, usually 2 Type 45 destroyers of the Royal Navy and an Arleigh Burke, plus a couple of frigates from the Royal Navy and another couple of vessels from Allied navies, and usually some Royal Fleet Auxiliary supply ships. We won't get into current issues with them. But the whole thing is that task group tends to turn up in the Far East. And it tends to turn up in the Far East on exactly the schedule which fits in with the American refit schedule. It's almost as if someone's had a quiet conversation and the Royal Navy gone, well, we need to do a big cruise every so many years to demonstrate and maintain the capabilities to do a global cruise, so we can operate globally and demonstrate that we can do. And it's useful for us to be able to do so because we're building up relationships, commercial and diplomatic, in the Far East with Japan, Korea, Singapore, Australia. We're trying to build up those relationships. So yeah, we're going to do that. We'll do that. We'll turn up. We'll do this. And it makes sense. But the reality is, the backbone of everything, of this 1,000-ship fleet and all this, was the Nimitz Class. It's the 10 ships in the Nimitz Class. Reason they are the backbone of it, the reason they are so important to it, well, simple really. They are the command and control centres which can wrap those fleets together. They're also the USP of the Americans. When they turn up and they go, come on, do you want to operate under our umbrella? To do that, you have to follow our instructions. We have these great centerpieces. We have some good core ships around them. We don't have as many as we used to, but we have good core ships around them. So please fold into our umbrella. Fold into our force structure. This is what RIMPAC and other major exercises are about. They're about developing the capacity to fold into that force structure, to operate together. But still, it's not really enough. It's not really enough. Counting the Charles de Gaulle and the Queen Elizabeths, you can say that the Western powers, along with the Nimitz Class and the single Gerald Ford in service, have 14 carriers to cover the world, to be their presence and deterrence. That's not enough. Not for the 1,000-ship navy, and certainly not enough for the current scenario. If we consider the 600-ship navy, well, when that was launched, the USN alone had 2 Midways, 4 Forrestals, 4 Kitty Hawks, USS Enterprise, and 3 soon to be, well, actually 3 soon to be 5 Nimitz is in service. So putting that together, that's 6 nuclear powered supercarriers and 10 conventionally powered supercarriers, or rather 8 conventionally powered supercarriers and 2 midways. I had 16 carriers at the core of their, for most of the 1980s as a core part of their force. Out of 600. Add in the LHAs, it's a far higher density of carriers than we're talking about today. And the average size of the combatants was different as well. And you can argue as well, more importantly in that period, they had nuclear cruisers as well as some of the more conventional vessels. And the thing was, those ships added up to extra presence. Those ships added up to a stronger core. Those ships added up to a less stress core. History hasn't ended. And the Nimitz Class are still dealing with that. They were born into a world of bipolar contention. If Nimitz does end her service life on the timescale she's supposed to, she'll be ending it in a time of multipolar contention, where the world has, in many ways, gone back to how it was prior to World War One. There's a really interesting discussion where people keep trying to draw similarities with the 1920s and 30s. And I can understand that affliction. That's a beloved memory for many to go back for, because that was a nice and simple time. There were good guys and bad guys, and it's relatively easy to work out who is who ultimately. Yes, sides are a little bit grey and a little bit edgy, and there's problems with them, but overwhelmingly there's one side which are probably worse than everyone else. Or rather, one nation. Yeah. The thing is, that's a factional world, but it's not a multipolar world. There were distinct factions, but it's not a multipolar world. The world prior to World War One, even with the alliances you had going on, was definitely multipolar. There were multiple power centers, multiple powers, like today, major regional powers who were dominant in their regions. There were global powers. There was primus inter pares of the world. First among equals. Primus inter pares. Mainly that was Britain at that time. But that was it. And there were powers queuing up to challenge Britain. It wasn't just one. And some powers challenging Britain were, let's be honest, nations which really shouldn't have been challenging Britain because of their economic status and the situations they found themselves in. But they were still doing it. And some were the coming power. And there were lots of people commenting, Britain should just give way because this power's coming through. And for those who think I'm only talking about Germany, no, look up the articles. The countries nominated, whilst Germany was definitely one of the favourites, there is also occasionally America represented there. There's also Italy, Japan in one newspaper article I read. All sorts of contenders for the new primus. And the fact is, that was going on from about the 1890s onwards. It doesn't hand over realistically in terms of the world policeman role until after World War II, which means Britain remains de facto the first among equals until well into World War II. Why? Because as much as America might have the potential and capability to after World War One, Thanks to the United States Senate and its funding priorities, they don't have it happen. It isn't actually a realistic thing. That's the trouble with life. Sometimes it just doesn't make it any fun for you. So, history hasn't ended. And the Nimitz class are now growing up everyone else with them. They are trying to build up the strength of the world on their shoulders. And it's led into what some argue is Cold War II, and what I would honestly normally refer to as a return to international relations as normal. You see, again, there is the scenario from the Cold War where it was an us or them bipolar world where, both sides were staring at each other thermally and there was all sorts of competition going on. But the reality is, the world historically hasn't been like that. It wasn't like it during the 1920s and 30s. It wasn't like it during World War I. It wasn't like it during World War II. It wasn't like it during the hundreds of years prior to that. The thousands of years prior to that. It's very tempting to believe as humanity that we have grown up, that we have moved beyond things. That we have moved beyond the role of these things. And the Nimitz class have been an example of this. As we have gone through these emotions, these periods, they've been the apogee of American power, they've been the lagging symbols of a backwards-looking nation. They've been the ultimate American presence. They've been so outdated. You don't need an aircraft carrier of that size anymore. We don't need that many aircraft, Our stealth aircraft are so good, we only need a handful of them and they will just wipe out anything we'd have to fight. Because, it's not as if we'd be fighting a peer threat who might actually have some systems which could actually detect stealth or can, under the right circumstances, do what they need to do, provide enough mass that they actually could get lucky. That's the problem they faced, most of all, throughout their career, has been the context of the world. Their capabilities have remained the same. Their abilities to support American interests, to protect American interests, to be the capability that America needs them to be, has remained. It's not the carriers which have changed over time and their value which has changed. It's the context we see them in. Because the debates are all short-term. We're talking about carriers which have seen 5 decades of history. The fall and the rise and fall of empires, let alone the fall of great empires in terms of post-World War II empires. They have seen far more history and far more international relations up close than the vast majority of the people who are making decisions at the highest levels of government over whether or not they get funded. They are long-term assets. They're not about tomorrow. They're not even about today. They're certainly not about yesterday. They're about next month, next year, next decade. And that's when they really start to matter at this point, because their flexibility. The Nimitz class, despite having lost their nuclear-powered escort, which would have kept them going. And there had been a program to provide the next generation nuclear powered cruisers, the Strike Cruiser program, but that was of course cancelled. Despite having lost that, they are still strategically mobile. They're still the core of the battle groups. And they're able to do those roles. Not the same way as they may be envisaged, but they can still do it. And they do still rush around the world from crisis to crisis. And it is a big thing when there are no American carriers in a region. When there isn't a carrier there, you notice it. You notice it in the actions of nations. You notice it in the actions of both allies and not allies. It's terrible to say, but it doesn't matter if America has land bases in the region and troops there and aircraft there. No, if they don't have a carrier battle group present, then as far as it seems to be believed, the teacher's left the classroom. And that is really going back. That is really going back to international relations as it always has been. You can argue there were lots of periods where there wasn't even a teacher. It was just a classroom the whole time, unattended. Or maybe the playground, unattended. But international relations has rarely been so black and white, so simple, relatively speaking, as it was in the Cold War. And the period since then, where these carriers have continued to ply their trade, continued to be called upon for every crisis, continued to be the visible American statement of power, presence and interest in a world which was changing, has just reverted to that. So, this video was a little bit more discursive than it probably set out to be, but it was an overview of a class. And I can either give you very nuts and bolts of operations, but I like doing that in operations videos. And the Nimitz class do deserve a key ships video, but I might do a two-parter key ships for them because there's really the ones prior to George Washington and the ones after George Washington. You can divide them into different batches. I know officially it goes the Nimitz subclass, the Roosevelt subclass, and then the Ronald Reagan subclass. But the Reagan subclass is more about pushing in the technologies into the Nimitz class hulls, which are going to be upgrading them to make them more sort of forward compatible to Gerald R. Ford's, and also testing out the technologies for the Gerald R. Fords. The Teddy Roosevelt ones, what can I say? We technically called it one group, but I would almost say Teddy Roosevelt and Lincoln are about transitioning from the Nimitz baseline models to what comes out of the George Washington afterwards. It's kind of like a forerunner of the Reagans. And yeah, the first three, Nimitz, Eisenhower, and Vinson, are pretty much the group which are most homogeneous in some regards. So yeah, maybe key ships video for this class will be 2 videos, possibly 1, but there will be key ships for this class. When I first started recording videos and started recording the videos for this particular topic, and this is not even the first go through today, and honestly the final video might be a compilation of different sections from today's recordings, When I first started going through this topic, the thing that impressed me was not necessarily how much I already knew about Nimitz Class and their activities from just keeping abreast with naval affairs, because they come up so often, but how there was still more to learn. There was still more to experience in learning about them. They have both become lead actors and part of the constant background of naval history in their time period. It was quite shocking, really, to learn again something which had fallen right to the back of my mind, that they were Nimitz was laid down in 1968. It was, when I was putting this video together, I went, I can't be right. My old notes must be wrong. And I went and checked the books. I went, no, it is 1968. They don't feel like it. They don't feel like a product of the 60s. They don't feel like a product of the Cuban Missile Crisis. Which I didn't mention much at the beginning because, honestly, it doesn't have that much to do with their design flow. Vietnam is far more important. But it's really strange to think about this. That when we're talking about Nimitz, we're talking about a ship which was being designed while Chester Nimitz was still alive. He dies in 1966, aged 80. A couple of years before she's laid down, and let's be honest, something this complicated is taking a fair number of years. She's ordered officially in 1967. So she's been well on the design path while Nimitz was still alive. We're talking about a class that I listed out all the operations they were involved in, and there is actually a recording somewhere of me going through, reading off every single acknowledged operation the class has been involved in. I kid you not, it took me about 10 minutes to read through it all, and I was just reading the names of the operations. That gets kind of scary. That's one of the reasons why this video is as discursive as it is, because this video is going to be well over 2 hours long. And if I'd gone into detail on every single operation that probably deserved being part of this video, if I included any of them, then it could well have been 6 to 7 hours long. And goodness knows how many hours that would have taken me to record, because this as it is has been about 12 hours recording work. They are ships which are part of the very fabric of the modern world as we so describe it at this time. And the saddest thing for me to think is that they won't get preserved. The very way they've structured the program they have with Enterprise, etc., means that there is almost no chance that one of these ships will get preserved. The fear is their nuclear reactors. Basically, for them to be preserved, you need to cut out the reactors and probably a few other things to make it viable to preserve one. And as they haven't preserved any of the other carriers, the non-nuclear carriers, getting them to preserve a nuclear one, and that is sad. And when I talk about the other carriers, I'm talking about carriers of this sort of generation of carrier design. Okay, not the Midways and the Essexes and those vessels. I'm talking about the carriers of this generation. It's very sad. This class has defined America. It's defined American presence for 5 decades and counting. Because that's the other thing to think about it. It's we are talking about this now, and they're coming up on 50 years. That's great of service. But, as said earlier, we could be dealing with things which could be getting at least another 35 years of service out of them, so they could be 85 years of cumulative service. They could end up getting to 100. We don't know how that particular piece of history is going to work out, because that's a long way in the future. The odds are we have not even conceived of the type of aircraft which will be the last to fly from these carriers. The average carrier spans four generations of aircraft in its history and service. If you look it up, it's roughly 4 generations of aircraft for each carrier. These carriers, they could well see 6, maybe even 7 generations of aircraft in terms of their air group composition and form. And I mean that principally because if anyone considers that the F-18 and the F-18 Hornet and F-18 Super Hornet are part of the same generation of aircraft, then I have a bridge over the River Kwai to sell you. Not even the bridge over the Thames. I'm going straight for the River Kwai. It's gotta be swish. They are going to be it for at least the next 3 decades. They're going to be it for the United States Navy. It's going to take that long for the majority to shift from them to the next class, if the next class are being built. The Gerald R. Fords, the American government keeps being surprisingly cagey about how many of them there are going to be. Will there be another 10 of them? Will the George H.W. Bush be replaced by the class which succeeds them? We don't know. That is so many cycles of government in the future. We have no frame of reference to be sure on that. And who will the enemy be in that time? Who will be the threat that is being managed? Who will be the threat that needs to be seen to? Needs to be contended against? It needs to be deterred. And the trouble is with deterrence and presence is these are ephemeral things. I was having this discussion the other day in the comment section actually on a video. What value can you place on deterrence? How can you prove deterrence? It's a lot cheaper to have peace and pay for deterrence than it is to have war, but it's far easier to quantify the effect of war than deterrence, because you're trying to prove a negative. You're trying to prove something didn't happen because of something. That they decided not to mobilize their armed forces because you were there. Well, how do you prove that? Can you read the minds of the opponents? Is it something they're likely to write down? No. It's a nightmare. But we know that we can point to them and go, this happens because of this, but we can't necessarily prove it. We can say, this happen, this they turn up, this doesn't happen, so we're using logic to try and prove it. But you'll have heard me use this phrase before, post hoc ergo propter hoc. After, therefore, because. It's a logical fallacy. You could point out that World War II comes after the interregnum, where the British got rid of their monarchy for a short period of time and had Oliver Cromwell. And because the interregnum fell, that's why we had World War II. Now let's leave out a few hundred years in between, but it comes after, so therefore because of. Doesn't follow. Now, admittedly, that's taking it to ad absurdum, and that's also another fallacy, but arguing from ad absurdum notwithstanding, that is an example of what you can get. So it's difficult to prove. Therefore, it's difficult to quantify. But peace is far nicer than war, and far better economically than war. But the trouble is, disarming to create peace doesn't tend to work. We know that because we've tried it. At several points in history, they have tried the concept of disarming for peace. Every time they do, they claim it's the first time. That just comes around. It's not. And it hasn't worked. Because, believe it or not, people are only peaceful when they feel strong. People only seem to be peaceful when they feel that that is the best route for them. And that can require a carrot and a stick to achieve. That's often what the world policeman role is about. Being the stick to make the carrot look better. A lot better. Because let's be honest, carrots are pretty boring. It's brightly coloured vegetable, but it doesn't really taste of anything that much. I mean, it does depend on the person cooking it to an extent, but yeah, they're not the strongest flavour or flavour in the world as a carrot. So, these were the stick. These have been the stick. They are the stick. They will be the stick. Or at least the very visible part of the stick. And that's what matters for deterrence and conflict management. This is another interesting thing when you get into the whole submarine versus carrier debate, and that's been a constant throughout their careers. The point about a submarine is it's an ambush predator. Revealing its position should always be the very last thing you consider in terms of deterrence. Because most of its deterrence is by, you don't know where it is, but we're telling you it's not far away from you. Or rather, can you afford to presume it's not anywhere near you? Aircraft carriers, though, are the big visible, we're here, we're interested, and we're looking right at you. Oh, and I have a lot of my friends above me also looking right at you, and I have all my other friends around me all looking at you. We're all incredibly interested. All incredibly interested. So what's the question for today? That's the thoughts. What's the question for today? Well, the question is simple. I want you to think about the carrier group, and I want you to think about the battle group, as it currently is, of the US Navy and Nimitz Class. I want you to look at their history, and I want you to design the carrier battle group, an air group, that you think would be a sensible fit, using only systems already in production. Don't start inventing whole new systems. They don't exist, and they're not going to at the moment. For the 2030s. Think about it. What would that air group look like? What would it be? It's an interesting discussion to have. and I'll look forward to what you write below and what you come up with. So, I have a little announcement. Thanks to you, because it will be you, both me and Drac have been nominated for an award. We're actually competing against each other in the Maritime Foundation's Award for the most influential use of social and immersive media. And that takes place on October the 17th in London. Now, I will be trying to organise tickets so I can go, and putting all that together, so that should be fun. And I'm hoping to take a fair number of the Shipshape crew with me. I don't know who else is going to be there, but I hope a lot of people are there. It looks like a very interesting group to be part of. It's kind of weird that, well, myself and Drac are both quite high up the list. I'm presuming it's in alphabetical order. So that would explain it, but the good old Alex Clarke really does help, and the Blue Marine Associated Foundation is above us. And look at all these really cool organisations, and then there's Janice Clarke and Dragonabel in that. And we're trying our best and doing all the stuff we can, and thank you for nominating us. Thank you. It'd be really nice to win it. Honestly, myself, with Drac in there, I don't expect to win. It's nice to be just part of it. I know at one point my publishers were thinking about putting my book forward, but I don't think they did, so I'm not on the book list. But seeing as Norman Freeman's on there, technically from the same publishers, I don't feel too bad. I'm sure Freeman should probably, I would hope he would win. But thank you very much again for your support. I literally got the news today. I'd been nominated and got the news today that when the thing was going to be in, and so I'm going to, when I have my next paycheck, I'm going to book a ticket. Oh, I don't know how much the tickets price are, but I'm going to do that. I'm going to try and organise the Shipshape crew that we book together, the ones who are going, so that we can be booked in together, because it's nicer to have some pals. Wearing black tie and doing all that, and I will of course make sure I am in full tuxedo, of course, for it. Hopefully I can find my tuxedo and fit into my tuxedo from the move. It's somewhere in the boxes up there. I'm just going to have to dig it out. As for the pneumonia recovery schedule, right, and well, next week we have War is Over, War has just begun, the current carrier generation, and David T's alternate history, naval history, heritage, what ships will we preserve, and there's also going to be Scuttlebutt, and there might be another video as well. I might try and do 4 videos in the week. I might see if I can push my body to do that. I'm starting to feel a bit stronger. I managed to do 12 slow-ish jogs from end to end of our garden today before I started having a and really I did sound like a blooming steam train. It was embarrassing. What I love is my dogs were running with me, and both of them were looking at me going, "You're going slow, Papa." It's when your dog's doing circles around you while you're running, even the corgi, and and you're sort of going, "Yeah, usually I'm a bit faster than this, and I'm pushing myself, but I'm trying to be sensible. I'm just testing myself out." Yeah. Embarrassing. And the Calyx Fund. Thank you for all your support. Thank you for all the money for Calyxes. I'm still taking it in because there's so many Calyxes are needed, but the first set of them will arrive Monday, so hopefully I will have a lot more books out by the end of next week. A lot more books out. And hopefully we can therefore return to something more approaching normal pace of production of videos, because, don't take this the wrong way, ferreting through boxes to find books is not as easy as going through bookshelves. It really isn't. I don't know why, it just is not. Thank you again for your kindness and generosity. As I always say with this channel, It would be nowhere without your help. It would be nowhere without your support. And thank you. Just thank you. Anyway, I hope you enjoyed the video. I hope you found it interesting. And take care. Toodles, and see you for brew ships tomorrow evening. Or maybe on Twitch tomorrow morning for more Ultimate Admiral Dreadnoughts. Who, by the way, if we skip back, you will notice are another contender for this award. Yes. Ultimate Admiral Dreadnoughts are up there. From Gabe Labs Inked. So who knows, I might get to meet them and make some suggestions about their ship designs. That's both a good reason for them to arrive and and something which they probably means they shouldn't want to come, but we can have some fun. Thank you again to everyone who nominated us. Thank you. Take care and have a nice evening.